Welcome, friends. This is Economic Update, a weekly analysis of major economic trends and events, the forces, both national and global, that shape our economies, our jobs, our incomes, our taxes, all the things we call the economic aspects of our lives. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life at several universities. Currently, I teach at the New School University in New York City. I also write columns of economic analysis for the website truthout.org. It's a courageous source of independent news analysis, and commentary daily. If you are interested in the analyses we present on this program and would like to follow up and learn more, please visit our websites. The first one is rdwolf.com, and the second one is democracyatwork.info. You can also sign up there for our free monthly newsletter that brings these kinds of analyses to your attention free of charge. I also want to invite you to keep sending in your comments and your questions. We answer a few toward the end of each program, but we also use your expressions of interest, what's on your mind, to help shape our programs. And those, like everything else, can best be sent to our two websites, rdwolf.com and democracyatwork, all one word, .info. Let's turn then to the economic updates for today. Well, over the last week, President Obama has begun talking about the economy again, after having not done much of that for quite a while. He's traveling around the country, giving talks. So let's talk a little bit about our president and his comments on economics. The first has to do with this whole question of, has there been a recovery? President Obama is often fond of referring to a recovery underway. As you know, if you listen to this program or watch it, we don't think much of the recovery that's underway. It really doesn't deserve the name. We aren't even halfway back to the level of unemployment we had before this crisis hits, and that's no measure of a recovery. But I thought you might be interested in what most Americans think, because apparently there are folks saying that most Americans believe there's a recovery, and that simply isn't true. In June, a national poll was taken, and the reports of that poll were in the New York Times of the 23rd of July. Here were the results of the poll. 60% of Americans polled said that the condition of the U.S. economy today, that's in June of this year, is bad, compared to 39% who said it was good. Almost a 2-to-1 ratio of those who think the economy is bad, not good. And when the question was, is it getting better, the percentage who are positive fell. Only 34% think it's getting better. So the majority of Americans do not think the economy is in good shape, do not think a recovery has occurred, who do not even think a recovery is underway, because an overwhelming majority think the economy is getting worse or not getting better. And indeed, the mass of people are quite right, and the president is quite wrong. Let's be clear. In the last election, November of 2012, both candidates, Obama and Mitt Romney, were talking all about saving the middle class, reviving the middle class, taking care of the middle class, honoring the middle class. But what did the two parties with their two candidates do? On January 1st of this year, the election less than 2 months behind them, the two parties agreed to raise taxes on the vast mass of middle-income Americans. They raised the payroll tax from 4.2% to 6.2%. That's an enormous increase that took an average family's income and took $1,000 away from it. That's not helping the middle class. Then on March 1st, Republicans and Democrats, those pledged to help the middle class, adopted the sequester, a vast program of cutting back government supports to, you guessed it, the mass of people, middle and lower income people. And the impact of that is proliferating through our economy as we speak. Words about the middle class, yeah. Deeds make the life of the middle class harder and force more people out of the little bit of middle class that still remains. Let me turn next to the excuse used for raising taxes on the mass of people, like Obama and the Republicans did on January 1, and for cutting spending for the programs people need more than ever, which is what Obama and the Republicans did with the sequester that began March 1st of this year. The excuse is the national debt, the national debt. The government owes money, and we must do something about it. And how do you do something about debts? You bring in more money, raise the taxes on people, and you spend less, cut the government programs. That's everywhere in the world called an austerity program, and the excuse for the austerity everywhere in the world and here in the United States is the terrible problem of the national debt. We've talked about that. Today what I want to focus on is, okay, when you raise taxes and cut spending, do you actually make the condition of the national debt, which you moan so loudly about, better? Well, we now have an unambiguous answer to that question. Though research has been done, and it was reported on the 23rd of July in the French newspaper La Tribune, as in the English word tribune. There was a story by Romain Renier, the writer, which does a wonderful job. He takes the 4 most troubled economies in Europe that imposed on their people austerity. They raised broad-based taxes, like we did with the payroll tax here in America, and they cut government spending on social programs, like we're doing now with the sequester. The 4 countries in question: Greece, Portugal, Ireland, and Spain. And here's what Mr. Renier discovered. He compared 2012 and 2013, 2 years during which the austerity program took effect. In every one of those countries, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, and Spain, the deficits and the debt of the country as a percent of their gross domestic product, their total output of goods and services, got worse. You heard me. The program to deal with the national debt, called austerity, that hurts the mass of people, didn't solve the problem. It made the problem worse. What an amazing situation to describe. But you know, the explanation is very easy. It works like this. When you cut government spending and you raise taxes on people, you cripple your own economy. You slow it down. The government is the biggest buyer of goods and services, so if it cuts back, fewer goods and services are sold, and that means people lose their job. The employer doesn't keep people working to produce goods he can't sell. And if you tax people the way they did in these countries in Europe and the way we're doing in the United States, they have less money to spend, and so they buy fewer goods, and that means fewer jobs. So in fact, the economy deteriorates, therefore the tax revenues the government gets fall, and the debts and deficits get worse. It is a failed policy in Europe, as these 4 countries' data show, and it is a failing program here. No wonder President Obama thinks he must run around the country and say something to offset the reality of a deteriorating economy, which, of course, is not good news for whoever occupies the White House. The third update for today, it goes right after this and addresses this problem. Is there a way that the government could, at the same time, stimulate the economy and reduce the debt? If you even believe that reducing the debt is an important matter, is there a way to do that? And the answer is quick and easy. Absolutely, yes. And the way to do that is gaining more and more traction around the world, and even slowly here in the United States, is something called a financial transactions tax. Here's what it means. You know how when you go to the store and you buy all kinds of different things, you have to pay a sales tax. Whatever the price of the object is that you're buying, a little extra is added on for the state, for the city, for the national budget, it's a sales tax, sometimes called an expenditure tax. Well, you might not have known that not all sales, not all expenditures are taxed this way. The big example is financial transactions, buying and selling stocks and bonds, buying and selling derivatives, credit default swaps, all that kind of thing. The very instruments that are the major ways we speculate in our current economy. When I say we, I of course mean big banks, insurance companies, hedge funds, the major players in financial speculation. Well, they have a very nice deal. They don't pay a sales tax. So the idea is, let's levy one. Why shouldn't they have to pay a sales tax on what they buy and sell, just like the rest of us pay sales tax on so many of the things we buy and sell? And who in the world ever allowed them to escape a sales tax when so many other things in the economy have to pay it? And here's the arithmetic. The amount of financial speculation in these instruments, stocks, bonds, credit default swaps, all these arrangements, asset-backed securities, and so on. Here's the arithmetic. If you put a tax of 0.01%, that's absolutely tiny. 0.01%. Compare that to the average sales tax in this country, which is in the neighborhood of 5 or 6%. So you're not even doing 5 or 6. You're not even doing 1%. You're doing 1/100th of a percent. Well, if you levied that on all of the speculative buying and selling of financial instruments, you could raise, ready, hundreds of millions of dollars. The government could raise it from people who are the richest among us, who have not been paying for years, and who don't spend that money anyway on goods and services, because that's what we know about wealthy folks. So that money would instead go to the government. It wouldn't have to borrow, no increase in the debt, and it would have that money to help get our economy out of a crisis. There's a solution, very fair, very quick, easy to administer, easy to monitor. The only reason we don't have that is that the financial interests in this country don't want it, and they've got the money and the muscle to make sure they don't pay. Final update in this first section of the program has to do with people fighting back against all of this. And I want to recognize those people because their struggle is shaping our economy, but in a different way from the other things I've just described. So I want to recognize today the leadership of the NAACP in North Carolina. They have a program since April of this year called Moral Mondays. And here's what they're doing. The recent takeover of the legislation and the legislature in North Carolina by the Republicans and by the Tea Party branch of the Republicans has seen a slashing of programs for average people, cutting of unemployment benefits, raising of taxes on middle and low-income people, lowering of taxes on the rich, a pretty stark example of austerity at the state level on top of the austerity at the federal level that we've already talked about. But everybody isn't sitting and taking it. Everybody isn't resigned. Led by the NAACP and a dynamic leader there have been demonstrations, including people getting arrested to show the intensity of their protest on a regular basis, every Monday, and it is working. It is building a movement, and it teaches us something. Folks know that there's no recovery. That's what that poll I reported to you on a few moments ago shows. And they're not going to be fooled by what President Obama or anybody else says. They know the reality, and they are not anymore willing to pretend that there's a recovery when there isn't, and to accept the austerity being imposed on them. And the people of North Carolina and the NAACP are leading that fight, and that is bringing to the United States the kind of pushback that we see every day in Europe. Let me turn now, as I often do, to another set of updates that deserve our attention. I'm going to spend a little more time on updates that are short because there are so many things to bring to your attention, and it will be a little curt on the longer analysis. Over the last week or two, there's been a meeting of the 20 richest countries in the world, biggest industrial economies. They're called the G-20. And one interesting thing that came out of their latest meeting, which was in Moscow, Russia, is where they met this time. They move their meetings around each year, is they're planning to tax corporations. Yep, you heard me right. Tax corporations. And what in particular? Well, they're sick and tired, they say, of corporations using a very old trick to avoid paying taxes. And I need to explain this trick so that everybody understands it. It isn't all that complicated. Here's how it works. A company makes something. Doesn't matter what it is. Let's say it costs $10 to make it, and the company sells it for $20, so that its profit is the other $10. Now, the problem is that, let's say the country in question where the goods are made is Ireland, just to pick one. So the problem is you'd have to then pay income tax on your profit in Ireland. But let's suppose that Luxembourg, a tiny little country in the mainland of Europe, has a much lower tax rate on profits than Ireland, just hypothetically. Here's what you do. You produce it in Ireland for $10, as you always did. But you sell this item first to your own subsidiary in Luxembourg, and you sell it for $10. Since it cost you $10 and you sold it to your own subsidiary at $10, you report to the Irish government, we made no money. Cost us $10, we sold it for $10. Then the Luxembourg subsidiary takes this item and sells it to the final customer for $20. So on the books in Luxembourg, it says, we bought something from our parent company in Ireland for $10. We resold it for $20. We made a big profit, and they pay Luxembourg the very low tax rate rather than having to pay Ireland the genuine tax they would have owed if they were honest. All of this is done on paper. They simply maintain a little office somewhere in Luxembourg. They don't ship anything to Luxembourg. They ship from Ireland. It's all a paper game, but it gets them out of billions and billions of dollars in taxes. And imagine that being played around the world, all over the place. That's what corporations do. The big ones in the news that have been doing it on a massive scale, you know the names. Apple, Google, Starbucks, General Electric, on and on and on and on. And there's an explosion of anger all across Europe because the Europeans in the streets, like those folks in North Carolina, are basically saying, wait a minute, you're telling us we have to pay more taxes, you're telling us we have to suffer cutbacks in government services because there's not enough money, but these corporations have been getting out of paying their proper share of taxes for years to the tune of billions. You shouldn't be taxing us and hurting our public services. You should be going after them. And the Europeans go into the streets, and they're threatening the existing government leaders. So suddenly, we hear, oh, the G20 and the OECD, they're going to go get these taxes. Well, don't count on it. These corporations are going to push back. They're going to use the billions of dollars they don't pay in taxes by these evasion mechanisms. They're going to use a portion of the money they save in taxes to put pressure on the governments not to do anything that would prevent them from continuing to save billions on taxes. But make no mistake, what the corporations do directly affects the taxes you pay and the services you're not going to get. To give you an idea of the amounts of money, taking 4 or 5 of the biggest corporations and calculating how many of the taxes they should have paid they got out of in this mechanism, not to speak of all the other mechanisms they use, would be more than enough money to pay off the debts of the city of Detroit, save it from the bankruptcy, save it from the disaster that is befalling that major city once upon a time of America. But the issue isn't even raised. If you're interested in more information about the G20 and the taxing of corporations, If you go to the website Seeking Alpha and you look for the byline of George Kesarios, Kesarios, he writes very intelligently about this issue there. Okay. An example of what happens when a country allows corporations to use this kind of mechanism to escape taxes. I'm going to give you an example from Spain because it is so stark, and then a couple more examples. Here's the example of Spain. Spain has a serious problem. It doesn't have enough money, and this has affected not only the country as a whole, but its capital city, Madrid, in a major way. So what is Madrid doing, since it cannot raise from its own people? The unemployment rate in Spain now is over 25%. It can't raise from its own people the money it needs to keep going. And it can't raise from the government the kind of help that would otherwise be there, because the government in turn can't or won't tax the corporations, the usual problem. Well, in Madrid it is taking a bizarre form. Here's one. They are going to rename their subway stations. No longer the name of a beautiful part of the Spanish history or a beautiful part of Spanish geography. No, no, no. The new name for one of the major subway stops in Madrid, Vodafone. That's right, the name of a phone company. And here's the beauty of this, and if you understand this, I get my point across. The money that the companies avoid paying in taxes is used by those companies to say to the government, crippled because these companies don't pay taxes, say to the government, hey, we'll help you out in your problem. Here's a small part of the money we saved by not paying you taxes, and we'll help you out, but you've got to change the name of your subway system or your buses from whatever they were about Spain to the name of our company to give us advertising. What an amazing way. You cheat the government out of the taxes you ought to pay and then use it to turn the government into an instrument of your own private advantage. As if that weren't enough, here's more news about Madrid. Some of the greatest Spanish artists alive today produced artwork hanging in the City Hall of Madrid, available to everyone, the public of the chief city of that country. They're selling the paintings. And guess what? Yep. The same people working in the same corporations that don't pay taxes use a portion of the money they don't pay in taxes to the Spanish government to buy the paintings from the City Hall of Madrid, thereby taking those paintings away from the public and making them the private property of the very people who evaded their taxes. You gotta laugh to keep from crying. Same problem for Detroit. Detroit last week announced that it is looking to go bankrupt, the largest bankruptcy of a city in the history of the United States from day one. Detroit. We're going to come back and talk about it. But Detroit is a city suffering again, like the state of Michigan, like the United States, from corporations who've evaded their taxes, plunging the government into a difficulty, which is leading this government not to go after the corporations and the rich who got out of paying taxes. No, no, no. Instead, taxing average people or cutting back social programs and crippling Madrid, Detroit. Final example, the United Kingdom. That's right, the United Kingdom. What's happening there? Their government, also unwilling or unable to tax corporations, and they're rich, is also in a jam. So here's what they did. They had a public company, that's right, a public company, working with their National Health Service. The British have the National Health Service that we here in America don't have. Everybody in England is automatically eligible and insured for medical expenses through the National Health Service. They have what we don't. They've had it for decades. We haven't. One of the things that health service did was make a public service of collecting, maintaining, and providing blood. They sold that to a private investor. They privatized their blood system. And guess what? The private company they sold it to, Bain Capital, the private hustling financial company that once employed and may still employ Mitt Romney, the Republican candidate. Might call him the candidate of privatization. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. Last item before we go into a major discussion is a struggle going on in Washington, D.C. It pits, on the one hand, the city council, the government of Washington, D.C., and on the other hand, the Walmart Corporation. And here's the issue. The District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., has a minimum wage of $8.25 per hour. If you do a 40-hour-a-week job and you earn $8.25, your annual income is $16,500 before the taxes and other withholding you suffer. It puts you right square in the level of poverty if you have a typical family dependent on such an income. It makes you poor. So the good leaders of Washington decided that was not a living wage. And so they passed a measure that affected big retailers, particularly like Walmart, which was planning to bring 6 stores into that area. And the living wage is $12.50. Hardly makes you wealthy, but it gives you a chance. Puts you at the poor end of the middle class, but a lot better than $8.25. And Walmart's response to the effort of the capital of the United States, a place where enormous numbers of very wealthy people live. It's a city that is a city of extremes of wealth and poverty. Paying workers at Walmart $12.50 an hour wouldn't change that fundamentally, but would make the poor a little less poor. And it would do so by charging a company that is one of the biggest, richest companies in the world, charging them to pay $12.50 as their bottom wage. The response of the patriotic Walmart, with its deep commitments to helping the society out of which they have made billions, to threaten not to bring their stores to Washington. They will not pay $12.50 an hour. They want to pay $8.25 an hour. The battle is raging. It is not yet decided. But that such a battle could happen, that this could go on, that we could have in the United States, the capital of our country, with people working 40 hours a week and bringing home between $200 and $300 a week to live on, is something that one ought to think about long and hard. Okay. Let me, in the little bit of time I have now before our mid-program break, let me begin by raising an issue I want to talk about. And that is the issue of the bankruptcy announcement this last week from Detroit. Let's go over the truth of everything. Detroit was one of the great cities of the United States. It was a city known as the Motor City, made big and powerful by the decision of a number of automobile companies early in the 20th century, when the automobile was replacing horse-drawn vehicles. The producers settled in Detroit for a whole host of reasons having to do with the rivers and the lakes and the place in the middle of the country and all the rest of it. Capitalism saw Detroit as a good place to make money off of cars. And indeed, it worked. For a while, Detroit grew. Detroit flourished. Detroit became one of the great cities of the United States, a success story of capitalism. Workers began to get paid better. Eventually, auto workers were among the best paid with the best benefits. And it wasn't just for white workers. African Americans were brought into the automobile industry so they too could begin to approach the so-called American dream. Money was made. Not only did the American car become the model for cars everywhere in the world, but also Detroit was such a center of a well-paid, thriving working class that it also developed culturally. Motown sound, the music of Detroit, became a music of the world. Detroit not only shaped the world by producing and distributing cars, it shaped the world by producing and distributing a spectacular music. Detroit was a capitalist success. When we come back after the break, we'll talk about how Detroit became a capitalist failure and what that means. Please stay with me. We'll be back in a few moments after this break. Welcome back to Economic Update. This is Richard Wolff, and as we return, I'm going to pick up on the story of Detroit. It's been in the news this last week because it has decided to apply to the courts for bankruptcy protection, which basically means that it cannot pay its debts and is asking the court to step in and decide what to do about that problem, and particularly what debts to pay, how much to pay which creditor. In other words, to try to recoup and rebuild a solid financial foundation after every effort to make Detroit a viable city has failed. Let's take a good, hard look. Detroit once was a capitalist success story, the center of the automobile industry of the United States, which was a leading industry in this country across the middle of the 20th century. The small city of Detroit became an enormously important major city because the auto industry was concentrated there. The big three, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, leading the way, brought prosperity to that country, to that area of the country. It brought well-being. It brought good jobs with good benefits. True, the union had to fight for those jobs, but so much money was made in the automobile industry as the United States took the world leadership in that field that the companies could accommodate the struggles of the workers when they really didn't have much choice, but they had the money, so the jobs became good jobs. And the American dream of a middle class could be realized by the kinds of income and job benefits that auto workers were able to win from the automobile companies. It made a prosperous city. It made a growing city. And it made something more. It made a working class, a majority of the people of the city, with enough income to lead decent lives, to demand education for their children, to demand a city that had decent parks, and to develop their own skills. Out of Detroit came the Motown sound, a sound that changed music around the world. So it wasn't just the Motor City, it was also the Motor Sound City. A study in capitalist success. But the same capitalism that brought Detroit success also then turned around and destroyed it. And that's what we have to understand. First of all, who made the basic economic decisions in Detroit? Answer, a tiny group of people, less than 100. The major shareholders of the big auto companies and the boards of directors they selected. That's who made the decisions. And starting in the 1950s and 60s, they made decisions that were disastrous. Partly disastrous for the auto industry, but above all, disastrous for Detroit. For the auto industry, their bad mistakes, they couldn't compete very well with the Japanese and the Europeans. That's why so many of you, right now, drive Toyotas and Hondas and BMWs and whatever else. They also didn't understand the need to develop fuel-efficient technology for their engines. And they lost out to their competitors who made better decisions. Were they punished for this? Not much. They reacted to their own failures, to the shrinking profits, by saying, hey, we have another way to make money. We can move out of Detroit, you see, and we can move production to other parts of the United States where there isn't a strong union presence, where we can get away with paying workers much less than we have been paying them here in Detroit. The very success of the capitalist auto industry in Detroit led those self-same capitalists to see the logic of leaving, and they left, leaving behind empty factories and the destroyed lives of the people who used to work in those factories. How many people? Millions. In 1950, the population of Detroit was 1.8 million. Today, it is 700,000. That's right. 60% of the people of Detroit were deprived of jobs, deprived of a livable city by the vanishing of those jobs, so they ended up leaving town, tearing up their family, neighborhood relationships, yanking their kids out of school, moving at great expense and difficulty to another city, taking a job in an industry which then reproduced the same sad story in the new city that they had run away from in Detroit. Because this is a national problem. Detroit is not alone. Cleveland, right behind it. Camden, New Jersey, 2 steps behind. Youngstown, Ohio, the city in which I was born. Many, many others share, more or less, the disaster of capitalist decisions gone bad that paralyzed Detroit. They had decades to fix this problem. The auto industry didn't fix it. The auto industry made it worse. The mayors of Detroit, either because they were in the pocket of the big companies, or because they lacked the vision, or because they were afraid, they didn't do anything to change the basic downward direction. Nor did the governor of Michigan, nor did the president, past and present, of the United States. Detroit offers us an even more extreme example. In 2008, 9, and 10, when we were in the worst of the crisis that we're still in, the United States government was appealed to by 2 of the 3 auto companies, General Motors and Chrysler, for a bailout, which they got. The federal government took the money of all of us, billions of dollars worth, and bailed out General Motors, above all, and Chrysler. They bailed out the companies whose decisions had crippled Detroit. But they never bailed out Detroit. They bailed out the profit-making companies, but not the people. Stunning. They even had an agreement as part of the bailout called a 2-tier wage system, in which the United Auto Workers agreed with the Michigan government and with the federal government that they would accept that the workers then working would continue to get their $28, $29 an hour. But if there were new hires by the auto companies, they could pay the new people, even if they were returning old people who used to work there, half, $14, $15, $16 an hour. What that meant was, if the auto companies came back, they would make a lot of money because they could pay their new workers half what they used to. But of course, it was a death sentence for Detroit, because it meant that even if the auto companies came back a little, it wouldn't help Detroit much, because you're not going to get a city going again when you pay auto workers $15 an hour, which puts them in a poverty situation. So it is a capitalist failure. Failure of the jobs to be maintained, failure of the companies to be true to what had been the truth of Detroit, failure of government at all levels to come in and correct the situation that was getting worse decade by decade. The political system failed in this country, and the economic system failed. Millions of people. Capitalism has to be judged by its failures, just as it claims to be wanting to be judged by its successes. The leadership of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler cannot ask us to call them captains of industry when we look only at the time they took the economy up. We also have to look at them and hold them accountable when they take the economy down, and especially if taking the economy down for the majority of people happens to be privately profitable for the corporations and them alone. And that's the history of Detroit. It is something to think about, above all because of the stark injustice of it, and above all because so many other old industrial cities have suffered and continue to suffer the same fate. When a software company leaves California or New York and relocates its operations in Brazil or Hyderabad, India, the same process is underway. And it's having definitely horrific effects. One of the reasons real wages keep going down is because those jobs that pay high wages are the jobs that provide capitalist employers with the greatest incentives to leave. It's almost as if capitalism is now saying to the American working people, here's your choice. Accept low wages, or we're out of here and you'll get no wages. To which the American working class has to think long and hard about the answer. Do you choose between the two? Do you call the bluff and see if it's correct? Do you accept that that's the choice you have, low wages or no wages? Or do you say to those companies, no, excuse me, you don't have the right to leave us behind. We helped build this company at least as much as you did. You're not going to make a lot of money by giving our jobs away and leaving us to fend for ourselves. We're not going to let that happen. That's the real issue confronting the American working people. And the sooner they understand it and begin to think strategically about what to do in that situation, the sooner they'll get out of a dead end, the choice between no wages or low wages. Because where that leads, Detroit shows us right now. There's a larger question that lurks behind all of this that I want to address also in a few minutes. And that is this old question of the choice between public and private enterprise. This is a hotly debated discussion in this country, even though for me it's a little mysterious why. Liberal or democratic types are willing to consider having the government do all kinds of things, public enterprises, well, whether it be National Public Radio or the Amtrak system or the post office or the TVA producing electricity in the South, whatever. And Republicans are just as determined and heated with conservatives to say, no, the public shouldn't, the private is better at it. I find this bizarre. Are public companies liable to corruption? Sure they are. But so are private. Are private companies that can make disastrous mistakes? Of course they can. I just told you a story of the terrible mistakes and their consequences made by the auto companies in Detroit. And public companies can make mistakes too. That really isn't very interesting. For every mistake made by a private company, I'll show you one by a public company. And for every piece of corruption you can find in the government, I'll show you some in the private sector. That's not the difference between the two. They aren't that different on those criteria. But here's a big difference. The big difference. If you're a public company, then your job is to serve the public. That's the standard by which you're judged. Are you the post office? Okay. Well then, how much are you charging for stamps, and how well are you delivering the mail? If you're Amtrak, how much are you charging per mile of freight or passenger traffic? And what kind of service is the public getting from this public company? That's the issue. When you have a private company, you have a completely different issue. Yes, the private company serves the public. The public is the ultimate customer. But the private company isn't just judged by how well it's serving the public. It's also judged by how much private profit it's making its investors. And guess what? The leadership of every private company knows that if you go in to talk to the board of directors or the major shareholders, you better have a good story to tell about the profits they make. And if you say to them, oh, I'm sorry, we didn't do real well on the profits, but boy, we served the public, you'll be fired. Because the private company's number one goal is making money. The number two goal is serving the public. That's the difference between a public and a private company, and that ought to be the basis of a conversation, rather than making believe that there's some magical difference in the likelihood of corruption or mistakes between public and private enterprises. Nor does any of this have anything to do with socialism. Some people like to say that socialism is when the government does a lot of things, using as examples Russia, China, Cuba, and so on. That's not quite right. You know, if the government takes over an enterprise and fires all the board of directors that was selected by the shareholders and substitutes government officials selected by the government, the life of the worker there isn't all that different. He or she comes to work, does their job, and produces profits, no longer for a private employer, but for the public employer. All the key decisions are not made by major shareholders and the boards of directors. Instead, all the key decisions are made by government officials and the folks they put in charge of the company. The mass of people still make none of those decisions. Socialism, at least in Marx's idea, was something completely different. It had to do not with replacing private employer with a public employer, but replacing employers with the workers themselves. The whole point of socialism was that the workers would become self-governing, that the workers themselves would run and operate their own enterprises. Just like the democracy is not getting rid of an emperor and substituting a president, the point of democracy is self-government, that workers and all people should govern themselves, not change from one governor to another. Same thing with the private-public distinction. Socialism means much more a change in the way you organize production than a change in who runs the show from one small group of people outside the government to another small group of people inside it. The final segment of today's show, as always, has to do with comments and questions you've sent in. One of you, and I want to thank Jay for sending this in, draws my attention to a new movement in Canada called wagemark. And if you're interested, you can go to their website, wagemark.org. This is an effort of people to get corporations and other institutions to make a voluntary agreement that the gap between the highest and the average pay of anybody in that company or that institution is no more than 8 to 1. In other words, that the highest paid people don't get more than 8 times what the average or lowest paid person gets. They think this would go a long way towards narrowing the inequality of income in modern capitalist societies. Well, they're right about that, because the gap in the United States, for example, between the CEO who gets paid the most and the workers at the bottom of, say, the top 500 corporations is more in the neighborhood of between 200 and 300 to 1. So if you could reduce that to 8 to 1, wow. But this is a voluntary program, and my advice would be, don't hold your breath. Companies will be full of nice words, perhaps, of encouragement to this lovely initiative, but it'll be a cold day in a warm place before you see corporations moving in that direction. If anything, they're moving the other way. But I applaud the idea, and I'm glad at least that these folks are putting this issue out into the public discussion, which is long overdue because it shapes how a society works. Next question, big one, and I don't have enough time to answer it, but I want to thank Scott Fraser from Toronto, originally in his family back from Jamaica as his origins. He's asking about the relationship between capitalism and race. Wow, big topic, very, very important, and I'm glad he asks it. I think the relationship between capitalism and race is a complicated, shifting relationship. Let me explain what I mean. Capitalism has a peculiar relationship to modern black or African American population relationships. And we can see it by starting with the relationship between capitalism and slavery, what brought African Americans in large numbers to the Western Hemisphere in the first place. Clearly, capitalism was a major support and inducement for slavery. There are wonderful work in this area. If you're interested, you can pursue the work of Eric Williams or of Walter Rodney, two great writers who go into this in great detail. Basically, England's growth in the 19th century to become the dominant world capitalist power was based on their ability to produce and sell cotton textiles around the world. But in order to do that, the British had to have cotton. And because of the climate in Britain, no cotton grows there. So they had to find places to get the cotton, otherwise there wouldn't be a British Empire and a British Navy and none of the rest of it. And one of the chief places they got cotton from the United States, the southeast of the United States. The problem there was, in order to grow the cotton, they had to have labor. And the labor was provided by bringing slaves. So capitalism in England produces slavery in the cotton fields of the United States. So capitalism promotes the slavery. But then, in the Civil War, capitalism changed its relationship to slavery and was actively engaged in defeating the slave South and freeing the slaves. So capitalism in that case undid slavery. But after that, capitalism switched again. And it perpetuates a kind of subordination of the African American population, at least in the United States, putting African Americans in a constant disadvantage as the lesser of the folks in terms of jobs and income, creating a generation after generation of inequality, of inferiority, extraordinary. To this day, unable to provide the kinds of jobs and opportunities to African Americans that others in the country enjoy, often then blaming them for whatever the results of this situation are. So the question arises, could capitalism solve this problem otherwise? I don't know. It's clear that in the United States, capitalism has raised the situation for a small percentage of African Americans, but that's true of what it has done for the non-African American part of the population, too. There is a top 1, 2, 5% of both the white and the African American communities, and for that matter, the Latino communities as well. The question is, can you do something for the mass of people? And there, capitalism, particularly over recent decades, has basically answered, no, we can't or we won't. And there we are. So finally, what might be done? Well, since African Americans suffer disproportionately from unemployment and all the associated problems, my proposal would be quite simple and consistent with what this program has long talked about. We need a massive program of jobs for unemployed people, but they ought to be a new and different kind of job. And here I would use the example of that Marcora law in Italy I refer to from time to time. Let the government say to unemployed people, and particularly now, we will give you a lump sum of your entire unemployment benefits up front, on the condition that together with other unemployed who make the same decision, you set up a worker cooperative enterprise. That's right. We, the government, will give you the startup money and we'll provide the technical and other supports to get cooperative businesses going by, of, and for unemployed people. You will become the leading sector in this country. You will become supported to give Americans the idea of how a cooperative enterprise could and would be different from the capitalist enterprise. We're looking for this as a new way to organize enterprise. You know, if workers had owned and operated the enterprises of Detroit, would they have destroyed their own jobs to leave? Unlikely. Would they have given up on their community? Impossible. That's who they were. They are the community. A workers' co-op is a much better way to solve economic problems. And if you did it for unemployed people, it would be for white and blacks alike, but it would be especially important to give black Americans, African Americans, a chance to be part of a leading sector of the American economy. Not a poor cousin, but a leading sector. The focus of government efforts to lead the entire economy into a new direction. That would be a way of affirmatively acting towards a part of the population that needs that help and could become a leader for a new economic system. Thank you very much for joining me for Economic Update. I want to thank you for your patronage. I want to remind you that these and other topics are dealt with in greater detail at our two websites, rdwolff.com with two F's and democracyatwork.info. Please visit those websites for more information and to sign up for our free newsletter where we will bring these kinds of analysis directly to you. I look forward to talking with you again next week.